18 years old with 3 changes of clothes in a carpet bag and exactly $100 to my name when I signed the paper that changed my life forever. Everyone thought I had lost my mind. The old man who sold me that place could barely hide the smile in the corner of his mouth, as if he pitied me, as if he knew something I didn't know and wasn't sure whether to warn me or let me find it out for myself. The station was in ruins. The roof had collapsed in 2 places, and through those openings the Colorado sky poured in like water into a sinking ship. The stone walls were wrapped in ivy and mountain clematis, and a kind of yellow wildflower I had never seen before, vines so thick it looked less like a plant and more like a living quilt thrown over the building by some patient hand. The arched windows had no glass left in them, only the wind passing through so that the whole structure seemed to be breathing. And out front, standing on the rusted rails that the grass had almost swallowed whole, was the locomotive. Dormus, black beneath the rust, green with moss. 4 passenger cars lined up behind her like a funeral procession that had forgotten where it was going. A cottonwood sapling had grown up between the second and third car, right through the iron coupling, its young trunk bending around the steel as if the tree and the train had agreed to share the same piece of earth. I looked at all of it, and instead of despair, I felt something that is still difficult for me to explain even now, even after everything. I felt that I had come home. But let me tell you how I got there. Because this story does not begin at the station. It begins much earlier in a narrow house on the edge of a silver town that had already begun its long, slow dying, where a little girl learned every single day that she did not belong anywhere in this world. My father died when I was 5 years old. I have almost no real memories of him, only fragments, the kind a child's mind holds on to without asking permission. I remember the smell of engine oil on his hands, a smell like iron and warmth, and something faintly sweet, the way grease smells when it has been warmed by a boiler all day. I remember that he would close his eyes whenever he heard the whistle of a train passing far off in the valley, as if that sound were a song whose lyrics only he understood. And I remember the very last time he lifted me into his arms and told me that one day he was going to show me something very special. He never got the chance. 3 weeks later, he was gone. His name was Jonas Ashby. He was 30 years old. He was an engineer on the Silver Creek line, and people said he was the best one they had ever had. I didn't know any of that at 5. At 5, I only knew that one morning he kissed the top of my head in the kitchen and told my mother he would be home by supper. And by supper, there were 2 men at our front door with their hats in their hands. And my mother made a sound I had never heard a human being make before, a sound that was not quite crying and not quite screaming, but something older than either of those things. They told us there had been an accident. They told us the rail had given way on a curve in the canyon, that my father had saved every soul on board by pulling the emergency brake at exactly the right moment, and that he had not come home with the living. They told us he was a hero. My mother did not want a hero. She wanted her husband. Her name was Cordelia. She was 26 years old when she became a widow. She held me against her chest that night and rocked me on the kitchen floor until the lamp burned out and neither of us slept. And outside the window, the wind came down off the front range and rattled the tin of the stovepipe. And somewhere far away, so far away it might have been in another country, I heard the whistle of a train, and I thought even then, even as small as I was, that it sounded like a man calling out for someone who could no longer answer. My mother and I were alone together for 3 years after that. They were hard years, but they were ours. She took in laundry and mending, and I sat by the stove and stitched buttons back onto strangers' coats, and we ate beans and cornbread and sometimes a piece of salted pork when the work was steady, and at night she would tell me small things about my father. Careful things, the way a person might share the last of the sugar. She told me he had a laugh that started in his belly and moved up through him like steam rising in a boiler. She told me he could not carry a tune, but sang anyway badly and loudly whenever he was happy. She told me that when he was courting her, he had walked 6 miles through a snowstorm just to bring her a book of poetry she had mentioned wanting. She told me these things, and I held on to them the way a drowning child holds onto a piece of floating wood. Then she met Silas Holloway. I was 8 years old when he first walked through our door with a bouquet of paper flowers and a smile that never reached his eyes. I have thought about that smile many times in the years since. It was not a cruel smile. Cruel would have been easier to recognize. It was a smile that had been practiced in a mirror, a smile assembled the way a carpenter assembles a chair, each piece nailed carefully into place without any of the pieces caring about one another. His teeth were small and very white, and his mustache was trimmed into 2 perfect points, and he called my mother ma'am, and he called me young lady, and when he bent down to shake my hand, his grip was too firm, the way some men grip things they intend to own. My mother thought she had found a second chance. I thought there was something wrong with that man, but I was 8 years old, and nobody asked the opinion of an 8-year-old when her widowed mother has been lonely for 3 years, and a man in a clean coat shows up at the door with paper flowers. They married when I was 9, and that was the year I understood I had lost my mother too. Not to death, but to a version of her that I did not recognize. Silas did not shout at me. He did not strike me. He did something worse. He ignored me with a precision that took my breath away. When I entered a room, he would leave it. When I spoke at the supper table, he would continue his conversation as though I had not made a sound. When my mother asked him if he had seen me come in from the yard, he would say with a small frown that he had not noticed, and the way he said not noticed made it clear that he had noticed, and that the noticing had been a kind of effort, and that the effort was not one he intended to repeat. For years I wondered what I had done wrong. It took me a long time to understand that it was not about me. It was about him. I was the daughter of the man who had come before. I was the living proof that she had loved someone else first and loved him fiercely, and that no second marriage could ever erase that first one, and that Silas never forgave. Not her, not me, not my father, not the quiet room in her heart where Jonas Ashby still lived and always would. My mother fell ill when I was 16. It was quick and it was brutal, the kind of lung sickness that had been moving through the high country that winter, taking the weak and the tired. And my mother had been tired for a long time. In the last months, when she could no longer sit up, she would reach for my hand and hold it so tightly that the bones ached, and she would look at me with those eyes that had become so large in her thin face, and she would try to say something, and she could not find the air to say it. And both of us knew what she was trying to say. She was trying to say, "I'm sorry." She was trying to say, "I'm leaving you with him." She was trying to say, "Forgive me." I forgave her then. I forgive her now. She did the best she could with the hand the world had dealt her, and nobody gets to judge a woman who is trying to keep her child fed through a Colorado winter. She died in the early spring when the snow was still on the north slopes, but the creek had begun to run again in the bottom of the draw. I was 3 weeks past my 16th birthday, and that was when Silas Holloway looked at me for the first time in years with something clear in his eyes. It was not grief for what he had lost. It was calculation. It was the look of a man doing arithmetic. And the arithmetic was, what do I do with what is left? He did not put me out. That would have been almost merciful. Instead, he let me stay, and he made certain I understood the price of it every single day. My food was kept separate in the cold box with a label written in his tight, small hand. My bath water was drawn from the back pump in a tin basin on the porch. Even in the coldest months, because the indoor tub was, he said, reserved for paying company. The indoor company was rare. The principal was the point. When he had guests at the house, which was seldom, he introduced me as the daughter of his late wife's first husband, without name, without story, without any thread connecting me to him or to the roof over our heads. I slept in what had once been a storage room behind the pantry. He had cleared half of it out and left the other half full of crates and a dressmaker's dummy and a box of my mother's things pushed up against the wall, a box he had not thrown away and had not allowed me to open. I worked from the time I was 16, first at the general store sweeping and stocking, then at Mrs. Beeson's laundry on the corner of Bridge Street, where the steam from the kettles rose in the cold mornings and made the whole place smell like soap and scorched linen and the sweat of other people's work. I put aside every coin I could. A dime here, a quarter there. I hid the money in an envelope of brown paper beneath my mattress, and I knew, even if I could not have said it in words, that one day I was going to need it. I did not know for what. I did not know where I was going, but I knew I needed to have something in my hand when the moment came. By the time I was 19, I had $340 in that envelope. It was my entire world folded up inside a piece of butcher paper. It was the sum total of 3 years of rising before the sun and standing over a kettle until my palms blistered, and it was, I believe, the thing that was going to get me out. It was on a Thursday afternoon in March of 1897 that everything began to change. I was walking home from Mrs. Beeson's, my feet aching inside a pair of boots that were asking for retirement, when I saw the paper nailed to the telegraph post at the corner of Fremont and Bridge. It was a simple handwritten notice. The letters trembled a little the way letters do when the hand that wrote them has already given most of itself to a long life of work. It read in black ink that had been rained on at least once. Historic railway station, full deed included, $100, serious inquiries only, ask for Hatcher at the livery. I stopped in front of that post for a long time. $100, a railroad station, full deed included. It was obviously a joke or a mistake or a sign that the property had some grave defect. I was not seeing some curse that the whole town knew about and had agreed without ever having the conversation to leave well enough alone. I took the notice down from the post. Carefully. I folded it and I put it inside my coat against my chest, and I walked the rest of the way home with it riding over my heart. That night I could not sleep. I lay on the narrow cot in the storage room with my mother's box pressed against the wall beside my head, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about something my mother had told me long ago, back before Silas Holloway, back when she still spoke freely about my father. She had told me that he used to say the best opportunities in the world were the ones everyone else had already given up on, that the real value was hiding exactly where nobody was still looking for it. I had been 14 when she told me that. I had not understood it at the time. I understood it now. But there was something else that kept me awake that night, and it had nothing to do with the paper notice. It had to do with a conversation I had overheard 2 weeks before, one I'd been turning over in my mind ever since. I had come home late from the laundry. The lamps in the parlor were low. Silas did not know I was in the house yet. He was in the front room with a man I did not recognize, a man in a long dark coat with mud on the hem, and the two of them were speaking in the low, careful voices that men use when they believe they are alone. I stood in the hall in the dark with my hand on the wall, and I listened. I could not hear all of it, but I heard the stranger say something about a file, and I heard Silas say in that quiet voice of his, a voice I had spent 11 years learning to dread. He said, "We just need to make sure the girl never finds out what happened on the Silver Creek line." The girl. There was only one girl in that house. The stranger left soon after. I slipped into my storage room before Silas came down the hall. I did not sleep that night either. I lay in the dark, and I stared at the ceiling, and I tried to understand what it was I was not supposed to find out. The Silver Creek line, my father's line, the railroad he had given his life to, the railroad that had in the end taken his life in exchange. I did not know what it meant, but I knew the way an animal knows weather, that it was the shape of something very large moving underneath the surface of my life. Something that had been moving under there since before I was old enough to walk. And now, 2 weeks later, there was a paper in my coat pocket offering me a railway station for $100. I got out of bed before dawn. I washed my face in the basin on the porch, and I dressed, and I walked down to the livery on Fremont Street, and I asked the old man there for Hatcher. He was not there, but the stable boy, a freckled boy of maybe 14, told me that if I wanted to speak to Mr. Hatcher, I should come back on Saturday morning and he would walk me out to the place himself. He said it in the way a person gives directions to a haunted house matter-of-factly, but with the understanding that the listener ought to know what they were getting into. I walked back to the laundry and I worked my shift, and I did not tell anyone, not Mrs. Beeson, not any of the other girls, not Silas, especially not Silas. Saturday came. I met Obadiah Hatcher at the mouth of a dirt spur road I had not known existed, even though I had lived in that town my whole life. He was a man of 73. I would learn later, though, on that first morning he looked older and younger at the same time, small, a little bent at the shoulders, a straw hat on his head so faded by years of sun that it had become the color of dry grass. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked his whole life broad with knuckles like river stones, with calluses that looked like they had been layered on one at a time, decade after decade, until they became a second skin. He touched the brim of his hat when he saw me. He did not smile. And then he looked at me in a way that made my stomach tighten, not because it was an unkind look, but because it was the look of a man recognizing something without yet knowing where he had seen it before. His eyes searched my face. His jaw worked once. He looked away. He said, "Morning, miss." I said, "Morning." He said, "If you're still inclined to see the place, we've got a walk ahead of us." I said I was still inclined. We walked for 15 minutes up the dirt road. The trees closed in on both sides, lodgepole and spruce, and a few old cottonwoods with their bark peeling in long, pale strips. The light came down through the canopy in pieces. The air smelled of pine sap and cold water. Somewhere up ahead, I could hear the sound of the creek running. Then the road made a turn and the world opened up all at once. I stopped without meaning to. I could not take another step. The station was there, standing in a wide clearing with the mountain rising blue behind it and Silver Creek running bright along its eastern edge. It was larger than I had expected, much larger. The facade was cut stone gray granite quarried from somewhere up in the high country, with tall arched windows and carved ornaments along the cornices that must have been magnificent when they were new, and that even now, beneath decades of moss and weather, still carried a kind of wounded dignity. The clock tower rose from the center of the building almost 40 feet high, and the clock itself was still there. Its hand stopped at 22 minutes past 4, as if time had decided at that exact moment in some long-ago afternoon to stop walking. The roof of red colonial tile had given way in 2 places, and through those gaps trees had grown. Real trees, young aspens, their leaves already silver in the March light, leaning toward the sky as though they had been raised inside the building and were now reaching for the world above it. The walls were a tapestry of vines and ferns and tiny yellow flowers, and along the eastern side facing the creek, an entire patch of wild columbine had made a garden of its own. And in front of all of it, on the rails that the grass had almost completely consumed, stood the locomotive. I had seen old engines in pictures. I had seen them in the newspapers and in the front windows of the Mercantile when they ran the advertisements for the big lines. But nothing had prepared me for standing in front of one in the world. She was enormous. Black underneath, where she had been black once because now she was a composition of ironwork brown and mildew green, and that bright tangerine orange that iron becomes when it has been exposed to weather for many years. The 4 passenger cars behind her were in the same condition, their windows without glass, their side planking rotted in patches, parts of their roofs collapsed inward. Between the second car and the third, exactly as I would later see in so many dreams, a young cottonwood had grown up through the coupling, bending around the iron, with the patience that only a tree has, as though nature itself had decided to stitch those 2 cars together with living wood. Beyond the platform, past the grass and the wild rose, I could see the glint of the creek. The water caught the morning light between the trees, and there was a low mist on it, and the whole scene had the appearance of something that existed outside of ordinary time, a place you might walk into and never quite walk out of. I stood there. I looked at all of it. I didn't speak, and Obadiah Hatcher said in the quiet voice of a man who was used to waiting, "You can go in if you want." We went in through the front doors, which were not locked, only leaning against the jamb, the wood so swollen with years of damp that it took a firm shoulder to push them open. The main hall was enormous. The ceiling was high, perhaps 25 feet, and the wooden trusses above were still in place, though their beams were blackened with water stains, and some of them had cracked. Light came in through the arched windows and through the holes in the roof, and it fell in great golden columns, and inside those columns dust and pollen and the spores of ferns were floating in slow, silent motion like souls that had forgotten to leave. The floor was tile, hexagonal tile, blue and cream in a geometric pattern I could only see in the corners where the vegetation had not yet reached. In the center of the hall, a plant had grown up through a crack in the floor, a sapling of some kind, perhaps 2 feet tall, with wide, glossy leaves. There was a carved ticket window to the right, its iron grill rusted shut, and the hooks on the wall behind where the keys must have hung. To the left, a wooden staircase rose toward a mezzanine that looked down onto the main floor. At the back, 2 doors, one to what looked like an office, the other to the rear of the building where the platform lay. Obadiah stood near the entrance. He did not follow me. He let me walk through the space at my own pace. I turned to him at last. I asked the question I had not been able to stop asking in my head since the moment I had seen the notice on the post. Why $100? He considered me for a moment. Then he said because 100 is enough to make it a real sale and not a gift. I don't want to give it. I want to sell it. I want whoever ends up with this place to have chosen it. I asked if there was anyone else interested. He said in the 3 weeks since I put up the notices, you were the first person who has called. People walk past those posters every day. They turn their heads. The station has a bad name in this town, not because it's haunted, but because it's the symbol of a time people would rather not remember. The line ran through here for 40 years. When it closed, it took the jobs, it took the movement, it took the hope of a lot of families. People prefer not to look at it. It's easier to pretend it isn't there. I thought about my $340 hidden under my mattress. I thought about Silas Holloway in the parlor with the stranger in the dark coat, talking about a file, talking about making sure the girl never found out what happened on the Silver Creek line. I thought about the notice on the post with the trembling handwriting. I thought about my father closing his eyes when he heard a train whistle far away. And I said I wanted to buy it. Obadiah Hatcher looked at me for a long moment. His face did not change, but something in his shoulders shifted the way a man's shoulders shift when he's been carrying a thing for a very long time. And he has just begun for the first time to consider setting it down. He said, "All right then." We went into town that afternoon to the land office. The clerk behind the counter looked at me over the rims of his spectacles, as though I had come in with two heads. He looked at Obadiah the way one looks at a man whose sanity is in question. He read the papers. He read them again. He asked Obadiah twice whether he was certain. Obadiah answered twice that he was. I signed my name, Ren Ashby, in the careful schoolhouse cursive I had learned before my mother got sick. The clerk stamped the deed. He filed the carbon. He handed me the original in a folded paper sleeve. He did not wish me luck. He only said, "Good day, miss," with a tone that suggested he believed my day would not in fact be good, and that mine would be one of many not good days to follow. I walked out of that land office with the deed against my chest. I didn't feel what I had expected to feel. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel fear. I felt very clearly as though I had just stepped off the edge of something very high and I was in the air now, and there was no ground beneath my feet, and I would not know for some time whether the fall would kill me or whether I would learn on the way down how to fly. I went back to Silas Holloway's house one final time. It was already dark when I got there. The lamp was lit in the parlor. I could hear the clock on the mantel ticking in that slow, deliberate way it always ticked, as though it disapproved of everything. I went into my storage room. I put my 3 changes of clothes into the carpet bag that had once belonged to my mother. I took the brown paper envelope with my remaining $240 out from under the mattress and folded it into the inside pocket of my coat. I reached for the wooden box of my mother's things that had been pressed against the wall for 11 years, the box Silas had never let me open, and I lifted it into my arms. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it out of the storage room. I walked down the hall. Silas Holloway was in the parlor. He was sitting in his armchair with his back to the door. And he was not reading as he usually was. He was leaning forward toward the fireplace. He was burning papers. I stopped in the hallway. I could see him clearly in the mirror that hung above the sideboard. I could see the orange light of the fire on his face. I could see a stack of folded documents on the small table beside his chair. He was feeding them into the flames one at a time, watching each one curl and blacken before he reached for the next. He did not look up. I should have kept walking. I should have gone out through the front door and not looked back. But something caught my eye. One of the papers he had not yet burned had slipped half off the edge of the stack. The corner of it was visible hanging down, and on that corner in red ink that had faded to rust, there was a stamp, a rectangular stamp, 2 words inside a border, "Under review." I had never seen that stamp before. I did not know what it meant, but I felt in my stomach the same feeling I had felt the night I had heard his voice in the parlor 2 weeks before. The feeling that something very large was moving under the surface of my life, and that I was now close enough to see the shape of it, though not close enough to know its name. Silas leaned forward and took the paper and slid it into the fire. The stamp blackened. The paper curled. It was gone. He still had not looked up. I walked past the parlor door. I did not make a sound. I went out the front door and I did not let it slam because I did not want to give him the satisfaction of turning around. I closed it behind me, firmly, quietly, and I felt something loosen in my chest the way a hand that has been gripping you for 11 years finally opens its fingers. I walked out into the Colorado dark with my carpet bag in one hand and my mother's box under the other arm, and I walked the 3 miles out of town and up the dirt road to the station, and I didn't look back. Not once, not even when the lights of the town dropped behind the ridge, and the only light left in the world was the stars. I slept that first night in the main hall of the station on the tile floor with the carpet bag as my pillow and my coat for a blanket. I could hear the sounds of the woods through the broken windows. I could hear the soft, continuous voice of the creek at the back of the property running over stones. I could hear sometimes the call of a great horned owl, somewhere in the pines. The floor was hard against my bones. The air was cold. The mountain night came in through the holes in the roof and sat on my chest, and for the first time in my life, the place where I was lying was mine. Nobody could tell me to get up. Nobody could tell me to be quiet. Nobody could pretend I was not there. The walls belonged to me. The broken tile floor belonged to me. The tree that had grown up through the crack in the middle of the hall belonged to me. The locomotive on the rails outside, black and green and rust, silent in the starlight, belonged to me. I lay there and I looked up through the hole in the roof at a patch of sky, and I saw the Milky Way spread across the dark like a river I could not cross. And I thought with a clarity that surprised me that this place had been standing here all this time waiting. Not for me specifically, for someone who would not turn their head away. And I had come almost by accident, almost by the hand of something I could not name, and I had arrived. I slept. I woke up before dawn because the cold had crept in under my coat, and because a bird I did not know the name of was calling over and over from the edge of the clearing, a long, high, sweet note that ended in a kind of question. I sat up. The light was that particular blue-gray that comes just before the sun. The golden columns had not yet arrived. The hall was quiet. The plant in the center of the floor was still asleep, if plants can be said to sleep. I walked to the back doors and pushed them open. The platform was on the other side, covered in weeds that came up to my knees. The locomotive stood exactly where she had stood the day before, enormous and patient. I walked down the platform stairs through the wet grass, and I stood on the rails right in front of her. I put my hand on her cold iron flank. I didn't know then why I did it. It was only that I had felt looking up at her that it was the polite thing to do. As though she had been standing there a long time by herself, and someone ought to say hello. I stood there for a while with my hand on the metal, and the mist rose off the creek behind me, and the first band of gold appeared over the ridge to the east, and the station breathed around me, and I didn't cry though I came close. Then I heard footsteps in the gravel. Obadiah Hatcher was walking up the spur road. He had a canvas sack over his shoulder. He came around the side of the station and stopped when he saw me there with my hand on the engine. He did not move for a long time. I dropped my hand. I felt somehow that I had been caught at something private. He came up the platform steps slowly. He set the canvas sack down. He said, "Morning." I said, "Morning." He said, "I brought you some things. Flour, bacon, beans, coffee, a new kettle. It isn't charity. Call it an investment. If you starve out here in the first week, the station goes empty again, and I'm not of a mind to see that happen twice in one lifetime." I could not think of anything to say to that. He opened the sack and he took out the kettle and a small iron stove plate he had also brought and a little bag of coffee, and he made himself at home on the platform as though he had done this many times before. I watched him. I watched the way his hands moved over the kettle, the way he knew exactly where to set the plate so it would catch the draft from the gap between the boards. He built a small fire in the old brazier that I had not noticed the day before. A brazier that had been there since the line was operational, probably rusted but intact. He got the water on. He did all of this without speaking, and I let him because I did not know what to say, and because there was something in the way he moved around the platform that suggested he had not been up on these boards in a very long time, and that standing on them now was a thing he was not quite ready to speak through. The coffee boiled. He poured it into 2 tin cups. He handed me one. We sat on the top step of the platform side by side and drank it and did not speak and watched the sun come up over the ridge. The locomotive stood in front of us. The mist rose off the creek. Somewhere back in the trees, a woodpecker started its morning work. I said finally, "How long was the line in operation?" He said 40-odd years. Last train ran through here in the spring of 1883. That's 14 years this April. I did some arithmetic in my head. I had been 5 when my father died. That was 1883. The line had closed the same year my father had died. I didn't say anything. I kept both hands around the tin cup. The coffee was strong and bitter and good. He said after a while I worked on this line. Came on as an apprentice when I was 16, worked my way up, engineer for a good stretch, then track inspector when my knees started to go, then a little of this, a little of that, the way it gets when a company is shrinking down around you. I asked him if he had known the engineers well. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the locomotive. He drank his coffee. Then he said there was one in particular, best I ever worked with, the kind of man who could hear a knock in a cylinder head before it was even a knock. Just a whisper of a knock, an idea of a knock somewhere 3 miles down the grade. I waited. He said he had a way about him, used to run his hand along the side of the engine before he climbed up into the cab. Every single run. Didn't matter if it was raining or snowing or 90 degrees in July. He'd touch her flank right there where you were touching her, and he'd nod to her like you nod to a person. I had gone very still. He said he used to tell the other men that anything that carries people inside it deserves to be treated with respect. Used to drive the old-timers half out of their minds. They thought he was soft. He took a long, slow drink of his coffee. He said Jonas Ashby was the best friend I ever had in this world. And then he stopped, because he had said the name, and he had not meant to say the name. I watched him realize it. I watched the stillness come over his face, the stillness of a man who has just understood what he has let out of his mouth, and who is now waiting to see what the world is going to do about it. I set my tin cup down on the boards beside me. My hands had begun to shake very slightly. I pressed them flat against my knees. I said my father's name was Jonas Ashby. He didn't answer. I said, "Sir, look at me." He looked at me. His eyes were wet. I do not think he knew they were wet, but they were. I said, "Who are you?" And he was quiet for a long time. The sun had come up over the ridge now. The gold was on the station stones, on the rust of the engine, on the cottonwood sapling growing between the second and third car. A whole morning was beginning in the world, a whole morning in which nothing I had believed to be true about my life turned out to be quite what I had thought. He said, "Finally, some things have to be found miss, not given. Your father knew that better than anyone I ever met." And he stood up stiff at the knees, and he picked up his empty tin cup, and he walked away from me down the platform stairs into the wet grass toward the engine. He stopped beside her. He put his hand on her flank very gently, the way a man greets someone he has not seen in a long time. I sat on the step above and watched him, and I understood without being told that this old man in the faded straw hat had known exactly who I was from the moment I had telephoned the livery, that the notice on the post had not been an accident, that the $100 had not been an accident, that nothing about any of this was an accident. He had been waiting for me. For how long I did not yet know, but for a long time, perhaps for as long as I'd been alive. The sun rose higher. The mist burned off the creek, somewhere up the canyon very faintly, so faintly I almost did not hear it. I thought I heard the echo of a train whistle, though there were no trains anywhere for 100 miles. I closed my eyes the way my father used to, and I listened. The first week I didn't ask Obadiah Hatcher anything else. I could have. There were 1,000 questions rising up in my throat every time I saw him. And every morning he came up that spur road with something in his hands, a sack of potatoes, a blanket that had once belonged to his wife, a kerosene lamp with a clean wick. And every morning I opened my mouth to ask him, and every morning I closed it again. Because I understood something. I understood that if I pushed too hard too fast, this man who had waited 14 years to sit on that platform step would close up the way an old pocket watch closes, and I would spend the rest of my life listening to the muffled tick of whatever he was keeping inside it and never know the time. so I did not ask. I waited. I worked. I worked harder in that first week than I had ever worked in my life, and I'd been working since I was 16. I cleared the main hall first. I pulled up the weeds that had come in through the cracks in the tile. I left the young sapling in the middle of the floor because it seemed to me that a tree that had found its way up through hexagonal tile deserved to stay where it had decided to stay. I swept decades of dust and bird feathers and mouse bones out through the back doors and down the platform stairs. I found in one corner a coat that had been left on a hook when the line closed a wool uniform coat in the dark green of the Silver Creek service, and I left it hanging where it was. I cleared the office at the back. The ceiling in there was more intact than anywhere else in the building, and there was a small iron stove against one wall, rusted but sound. I dragged a straw tick I bought in town up the dirt road on my back 3 miles in 2 trips, and I laid it on the floor of that office, and that became my room. There was a water pump at the rear of the building fed by a spring somewhere up the slope that still ran clean and cold when I worked the handle. I drank from it that first week and did not get sick, so I decided that the water was mine now too. I cooked on the brazier on the platform, bacon in a skillet, coffee in the tin kettle, beans that I soaked overnight in a bowl beside my straw tick. I ate sitting on the platform steps looking at the locomotive, and the locomotive looked back at me, and neither of us spoke because neither of us needed to yet. And every afternoon around 3, Obadiah Hatcher would come walking up the dirt road with something in his hands, and he would sit with me on the platform, and we would drink coffee, and we would not speak of Jonas Ashby, and we would not speak of the Silver Creek line, and we would not speak of what he had let slip on the first morning, and we would watch the mist change on the water. He would leave around sundown, always by sundown, walking back down that dirt road with his straw hat in his hand and his shoulders a little less bent than they had been when he arrived. On the 8th day, someone else came up the road. I was at the eastern wall cutting back the ivy that had grown over one of the arched windows. I was wearing my oldest dress and a man's shirt I had bought at the general store, and my hair was tied back with a piece of twine, and I had a pair of heavy pruning shears in my hand that Obadiah had brought me the day before. I heard the footsteps in the gravel, and I turned, and a man was standing at the edge of the clearing with a wheelbarrow. He was perhaps 63, maybe 65, gray but not white, shoulders still broad, hands the size of tea plates. He was looking at the facade of the station the way a man looks at a horse he used to ride and has not seen in many years. He said, "Miss, my name is Ephraim Pickering, and I heard in town that someone had come out here to try and fix this place, and I wanted to see for myself whether the story was true." I said it was true. He said, "My daddy worked on this line. He was a section foreman. He put the stone in that eastern wall with his own hands. I'm not going to pretend to be a neighbor, come to make friendly. I'm going to tell you straight. I'm 63 years old, and I know stonework, and I do not intend to leave here today till you put me to work." I did not know what to say to him, so I handed him the pruning shears. He laughed. It was the first laugh I had heard in that clearing. It was a good laugh, a laugh with stones in it, a laugh that had been stored up for a long time and was glad to finally get out. Ephraim Pickering came every day for the next 3 months. He showed up at 7 in the morning with a hammer and a chisel and a sack of mortar. He mixed himself from lime and local sand, and he worked on the eastern wall. The way a man reads scripture with care and with time and with a patience that made me want to weep. He didn't say much. He whistled through his teeth while he worked. He stopped every hour and drank water from the pump and looked up at what he had done and nodded just once before he went back to it. More people started to come after him. A woman named Mrs. Adelaide Thornberry came up on a Sunday afternoon with a hat box under her arm. She was perhaps 55, a sharp-faced woman with gray in her hair and gloves so white I could not imagine how she had gotten them up the dirt road without a single speck of mud on them. She said her mother had worked in the administrative office of the Silver Creek Line back in the 70s as a junior clerk. She said her mother had died last winter, and in going through her things, she had found a hat box full of photographs of the station. She sat with me on the platform steps. We opened the hat box together. There were 47 photographs, the station in its working years, men in dark caps standing in front of the ticket window, a woman in a long coat selling oranges to a passenger on the platform, the locomotive in motion, steam pouring from her stack, a blur of linen and valise at the edge of the frame where a man was hurrying for his seat, a photograph of the main hall on a Christmas Eve with pine boughs over the ticket window and a lit tree in the corner. Mrs. Thornberry told me the names of the people in the photographs, the ones she knew. Her voice was careful and very precise. She didn't look at me when she spoke. She looked at the pictures the way a woman might look at a river she had grown up beside. She said my mother kept these for 30 years. I never understood why. She had not been there long. She was a young woman at the time. It had not been a happy chapter. I asked her once toward the end why she had kept them, and she told me, Miss Ashby, that she had kept them because she had always believed that one day somebody would come who was going to need them. I went very still when she said my name. I had not told her my name. She looked up from the photographs. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I know who your father was." I did not answer. I could not. She said my mother knew him. She spoke of him. Not often, but she spoke of him. He was a good man. I wanted you to know that. She put her gloved hand on mine very briefly. Then she closed the hat box and she handed it to me and she said, "These are yours. You will know what to do with them when the time comes." She walked back down the dirt road. She didn't turn around once. I sat on the platform with the hat box in my lap for a long time. The boy came on the 15th day. He was not exactly a boy. He was 22 years old, I would learn, but he had the shoulders of a man who had been at a forge since he was 12, and he had the quiet of a man who had been listening to iron tell him things for most of his life. His name was Tobias Marsh. His father had been the blacksmith on the Silver Creek Line until the line closed, and then his father had been the blacksmith in town until his father had died the previous autumn of a cough that did not clear. Tobias came up the road with a leather roll of tools over his shoulder and a canvas bag of iron stock, and he said, "Miss, I'm told that the front doors of this station no longer have functioning hinges, and I'm told that the ticket window will not open, and I'm told that there is no one else in 3 counties who is going to fix those things for you, and I'm offering." He said it like a man presenting a contract. I liked him immediately in the careful way a woman who has been ignored by a man for 11 years learns to like another man slowly and with watchful eyes. He got to work on the hinges that same afternoon. He did not ask me to pay him. He ate the beans I offered him at noon. He did not speak while he ate. When he was finished, he stood up and nodded to me and went back to the hinges and didn't stop until the light was gone. He came every 3rd day after that, sometimes every 4th. He would appear up the dirt road without warning, and he would work until sundown, and he would eat what I fed him, and he would go home. He and Obadiah would sometimes overlap on the platform late in the afternoon. Obadiah would watch Tobias work for a while. Tobias would nod to Obadiah the way a young craftsman nods to an older man who had known his father, and then he would go back to his iron. They didn't need to speak to each other. They had the understanding of men who had come from the same place and had both lost things inside it. I was starting, though I would not have said so out loud, to look forward to the days Tobias came. On the 20th day, I found the trapdoor. I had been clearing the office on the eastern end of the building, which I had come to understand had been the freight dispatch office in the station's working years. There was a heavy wooden chest in one corner with a hasp that was rusted shut. I had been unable to open the chest, and I did not want to break the hasp, so I decided to move the chest out of the way to sweep the floor beneath it. It took me almost an hour to drag it across the boards because the wood was swollen with damp and the chest was full of something I could not identify by feel. When I had moved the chest, there was a trapdoor in the floor. A wooden trapdoor with an iron ring painted over so many times that the paint had filled the grain like wax filling a wound. I knelt down. I put my fingers through the ring. I pulled. The door resisted. It was heavy with water and the hinges were stiff, and for a long moment I thought it was not going to open, and then it did with a slow exhalation of cold air from below. There was a ladder, dropping down into a darkness that was darker than the dark of any cellar I had ever seen. I lit the lantern Obadiah had given me. I climbed down. The basement under the freight office was drier than I would have expected. There was a vent grill high on one wall opening toward the outside, which had kept the space ventilated through decades of neglect. The walls were stone. The floor was packed earth hard as concrete. Along 3 walls there were wooden shelves, and on the shelves were boxes and leather mail pouches with their straps rotted through, and a row of ledger books with their spines cracking. In the center of the room there was a writing desk, an oak desk with a green leather top, the leather gone to stains, and a wooden chair pushed in under it. On top of the desk there was a box. It was a wooden box about the size of a Bible with brass hinges and a brass latch. The latch was not locked. It was only closed. I opened it. Inside, on top of a folded cloth, there was a single photograph. My hand was not entirely steady when I took it out. It was a photograph of 2 young men. They were standing on the platform of this station. I recognized the main arch of the facade behind them. They were in the dark uniforms of the Silver Creek Line, with caps with the brass buttons polished so bright they caught the camera. They were both smiling, real smiles, the kind of smiles that do not know they are being photographed. The young man on the right was heavier set, with a broad open face and dark eyebrows. The young man on the left was leaner, with his cap tilted slightly back on his head and a way of angling his shoulders that gave me suddenly and without warning a feeling in my chest that I did not know how to name. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in ink that had faded to a soft brown, Obie and Jonas, April 1874. I sat down on the bottom rung of the ladder. I could not stand. My knees would not hold me. I looked at the photograph. I looked at the face of the young man on the left, the one with the tilted cap. I looked for the fragments I had been carrying since I was 5 years old. The smell of engine oil. The way he closed his eyes at the sound of a whistle. The voice that had promised to show me something special one day. He was there, in that face. He was there in the eyes, in the way the jaw tipped down toward the shoulder of his friend, in the quiet laughter that was just about to break out of him. He was 20 years old in that photograph. He was alive. He was standing on the platform of this station beside his friend Obadiah Hatcher, and nobody in that frame knew yet what was going to happen to any of them. I sat in that basement for a long time. I do not know how long. When I climbed back up the ladder, the afternoon had started to tip toward evening. The light in the main hall was going amber. I walked across the tile with the photograph in my hand. I went out through the back doors onto the platform. Obadiah was there. He had come while I was in the basement. He was sitting on the platform step in his usual place with a tin cup of coffee beside him, looking at the locomotive. He heard my footsteps and turned. He saw the photograph in my hand. He did not need to look twice. I sat down beside him. I put the photograph on the boards between us, face up so we could both see it. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The light came down through the cottonwoods. The creek ran. Somewhere far up the slope, a hawk called once and then once again. I said, "You knew who I was before you ever met me." He did not answer. He picked up the photograph. He held it by its edges the way a man holds something that has been waiting for him. He said, "I knew the minute you called the livery. You have his voice, miss. The cadence, the way you pause before you ask a question. I knew before I turned around at the mouth of the spur road. I knew when I saw you walking up the track in that brown coat. I knew when you put your hand on the engine yesterday morning. I have known since the very first moment. I said, "Why did you not tell me?" And he said in that voice I was starting to learn the quiet voice of a man who chose his words the way a carpenter chooses his nails. He said, "Because some things have to be found, miss, not given. If I had told you, it would have been a kindness maybe, but it would not have been yours. The finding would not have been yours. Your father used to say that the best thing you could do for a person was to put a thing in their path and then step back, step all the way back, and let them walk up to it with their own feet." I watched the water of the creek move between the cottonwoods. I said, "Tell me about him." He told me. He told me that Jonas Ashby had come onto the Silver Creek line as an apprentice at 16 in 1869, that he had come from a small town farther south, down near the Spanish Peaks where his parents had died of cholera when he was a boy, and an aunt had raised him with the affection of a woman doing her Christian duty and nothing more. That the railroad had been the first place in his life that had felt made for him. That within 6 months, the senior engineers were asking for him by name. He told me that Jonas could hear a fault in a cylinder before anyone else could, that he used to say the engine was always telling you what was wrong if you were willing to stop talking long enough to listen. That he named his engine. Most engineers did not name their engines. The engines had numbers. That was considered professional. But Jonas had called her the Duchess, and nobody knew anymore why he had called her that, and the name had stuck to her so firmly that even the dispatch clerks had written it on the manifests. He told me that my father had walked 6 miles through a February blizzard to bring my mother a book of Emerson when they were courting. That my mother had kept that book on her bedside table for the rest of their life together. I didn't trust myself to speak for a while. I said finally, "What happened to him?" And Obadiah set the photograph down between us, and he put his hands flat on his knees and he didn't look at me. He said, "Miss, that is a longer story, and I will tell it to you, but not tonight." I accepted that. I did not press him. We sat until the sun went down behind the ridge and he walked home in the blue hour, and I went into the office and lay on my straw tick, and I held the photograph against my chest and did not sleep for a long time. The week after Silas Holloway came up the spur road, I was working on the eastern wall with Ephraim Pickering when I heard the wheels of a buggy on the gravel. I looked up. I knew the buggy before I saw the man. It was a black buggy with a red stripe along the wheel, and I had been seeing it my whole life, first from the window of my mother's parlor when he was courting her, and then for 11 years from the window of the storage room where he kept me. Silas stepped down. He was in a dark traveling coat and a flat-crowned hat. There was another man in the buggy, a younger man in a gray suit with a leather portfolio on his lap. Silas looked up at the facade of the station. He did it slowly. He did it the way a man looks at an opponent's hand when the cards have been laid on the table. He walked toward me across the clearing. Ephraim Pickering stopped working. He did not step back. He straightened up and he laid his chisel down beside him, and he stood there with his hands loose at his sides, and he looked at Silas the way an older dog looks at a younger one that has come onto the porch. Silas stopped a respectful distance from me. He did not look at Ephraim. He said, "Wren." I said, "Mr. Holloway." He said, "I see you have established yourself." I said, "I have." He said, "I have come on a professional matter. This is my attorney, Mr. Gilchrist. He is from Colorado Springs. He has looked into the records of this property, and there are certain irregularities in the sale that, if left unaddressed, could cause you considerable difficulty in the future. I thought it would be more neighborly to bring these to your attention in person." Mr. Gilchrist had come up behind him. He was holding the leather portfolio in both hands. Silas said there is an outstanding tax lien on the property from the period of its abandonment, that the county neglected to clear before the sale. There is also the question of whether Mr. Hatcher, given his advanced age and his isolation, could reasonably be said to have had the capacity to transfer a property of this kind. Mr. Gilchrist believes that a petition filed in district court could unwind the sale entirely. He believes a judge would find sympathetically for a proper buyer. I said, who would that proper buyer be? Silas did not smile. Silas never smiled, but the muscles in his jaw moved in a way I recognized. He said, I have some interest in the property myself, as your stepfather, as the man who put a roof over your head for 11 years, as a person with certain long-standing familiarity with the history of this site. I think an arrangement could be reached that would benefit all parties. I looked at him. I looked at him for a long time, longer than I had ever held his gaze in all my life. And I felt for the first time what it was to stand on ground that was actually mine. The tile floor behind me was mine. The walls were mine. The locomotive on the rails was mine. The old man and the young blacksmith and the stone mason and the woman with the hat box, none of them were mine because people do not belong to other people. But the affection between us was mine. The work we had done together was mine. The daylight on the granite and the mist on the creek and the cottonwood growing up through the coupling were mine. I said, Mr. Holloway, the deed is registered. The title search was conducted by the land office before the transaction. The certificates are in order. Mr. Hatcher is lucid, articulate, and in full possession of his civil faculties, as any conversation of 5 minutes would make plain to any judge. If you wish to contest the sale, I suggest you file your petition. In the meantime, I would like you to leave my property. The word "my" landed on the air between us. Silas did not move for a moment. Something crossed his face that I had not seen in 11 years. Not anger, not contempt. Those I knew. This was different. This was the look of a man performing an arithmetic and discovering that the numbers were not going to add up the way he had expected. He turned to Mr. Gilchrist. He said, we are finished here. They got back in the buggy. They drove down the spur road. When the sound of the wheels had faded into the trees, Ephraim Pickering picked up his chisel. He did not look at me. He said, that is a bad man, miss. I said, I know. He said, you handled him proper. He went back to his wall. That night I could not sleep. I lay on my straw tick, and I listened to the wind in the pines, and I thought about the stamp on the paper in Silas's fire, and I thought about the words I had heard him say in the parlor 2 weeks before I bought the station. The girl never finds out what happened on the Silver Creek line. Something was moving in the shape of my life. I did not yet know what, but it was moving, and it was moving faster now. I woke up in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. Not my stove, not a nearby campfire. Real smoke, big smoke, wood smoke. I ran out onto the platform in my nightgown and my coat. The sky over the ridge to the south was glowing orange. Not sunrise orange, fire orange. The kind of orange that means a building is burning. I ran down the spur road. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop for my boots, though the ground was cold and my feet were bleeding within a quarter mile. I ran. By the time I reached the edge of town, men were already running in the same direction. The volunteer brigade with their bucket wagon, women with blankets, children. I ran with them through the streets, and I knew even before I turned the last corner whose property was burning. Obadiah Hatcher's barn was on fire. The barn, not the house. The horse barn at the back of his little parcel. The roof was already going. The flames were reaching up into the night, and the smoke was going sideways in the wind, and men were throwing buckets of water on the adjoining roof of the house to keep the fire from jumping. Obadiah was there, in his nightshirt, a blanket around his shoulders, his white hair wild around his face. He was leading his mare, the only horse he had, out of the yard with a piece of rope knotted around her halter. The mare was trembling. Obadiah was trembling. I ran to him. I put my arms around him. He was smaller than I expected. He said into my shoulder, "I'm all right, miss. I'm all right. She is out. She is safe." The brigade got the barn contained before it took the house. By dawn, it was a smoking pile of black beams and ash. The mare was in a neighbor's corral. Obadiah was sitting on his front step with a blanket around him and a tin cup of coffee from one of the neighbor women in his hand. I sat beside him. I said, "Who did this?" He looked at the ashes of his barn. He said, "Miss, you know who did this as well as I do." I said, "Why would he do it? Why would Silas Holloway burn your barn? It does not make sense. It does not punish me." Obadiah said, "It punishes me for being the one who sold the station to you. It is a warning, Wren. It is the first warning. There will be others." He was right. The blue notebook was next. I found the blue notebook 3 weeks after the barn fire in a second box on a lower shelf in the basement. A box I had not opened yet because I had been working my way through the upper shelves slowly with too much care, the way you approach a grave. The blue notebook was the size of a ledger, hard-covered, dark blue cloth stained along the spine with what might have been coffee or might have been something older. On the front, in my father's small, right-leaning hand, a single line. Station Project. I opened it at the desk. 46 pages of my father's writing. He had drafted the elevations of the station restored. He had sketched the floor plan of the main hall, reorganized into a museum. He had made lists of the carpenters and stonemasons who might be willing to do the work. He had made rough budget estimates in the currency of his time numbers that now read like a letter from a country that no longer existed. He had listed contacts at the Colorado State Historical Society. He had written in a careful hand a history of the Silver Creek Line from its founding in 1841 to what he called its present difficulties. And on the last 3 pages, in a hand that was different, faster, more urgent, written all in one sitting, it seemed, a manifesto. He wrote that the station was not simply a building, that it was the memory of a time when the interior of Colorado had a future, when small towns were connected to the world, when a working man could take pride in his labor because his labor moved people and his labor moved stories. He wrote that the closing of the line would be, if allowed, the closing of something larger than a line. He wrote that he intended to dedicate the next years of his life to the restoration of this station, to turning it into a museum of the railroads of the Rocky Mountain West, into a meeting place for the community, into a thing the town could look at without turning its head away. The last line on the last page, "If I do not finish this, whoever finds this book, finish it for me." I closed the notebook. I pressed my forehead against it. I sat in the lantern light of the basement with the notebook under my hands, and I felt my father in that room more clearly than I had felt him at any other moment in my life. Not as a memory, as a presence. He had sat at this desk. He had written these pages. He had closed this book and slid it into this box and placed it on this shelf with the expectation that one day he would return. And he had not returned. But I had come. And I had found it. I climbed the ladder with the notebook in my hand. I went back to the freight office. I opened the chest he had sealed in the corner, the chest with the rusted hasp. I broke it this time. I didn't care anymore about preserving the hasp. Inside were more papers, ledgers, a folded railway uniform coat, a pair of leather engineer's gloves still soft, still holding the shape of the hands that had worn them. And beneath all of that, at the bottom of the chest, a bound envelope. I opened the envelope. Inside were 23 forms, 23 maintenance reports filled out in my father's handwriting, filed over a period of 6 months in the fall and winter of 1882. Each one documented a defect on a section of track in the canyon cut above mile marker 47. Each one recommended immediate repair. Each one was signed Jonas Ashby Engineer. and each one in the upper right corner bore a rectangular stamp in red ink, under review. I was looking at the stamp. I was looking at the exact same stamp I had seen on the paper that Silas Holloway had slid into the fire on the night I left his house. My hands went cold. I walked out onto the platform with the envelope pressed against my chest. Obadiah was not there. It was a Wednesday. He did not always come on Wednesdays. I sat on the platform step. I watched the light change on the locomotive. I thought about the shape of the thing that was moving under my life. I thought about the sentence I had heard through the parlor wall. I thought about the stamp in the fire. I thought about the stamps in this envelope. I thought about a man who had ignored me for 11 years, a man who had married my mother 18 months after my father died, a man who had built a house of silence around me, a man who had said to a stranger in a dark coat that the girl must never find out what happened on the Silver Creek line. The shape was beginning to have edges. Tobias came that afternoon. He came without warning, as he often did. He climbed the platform steps with the leather roll under his arm, and he saw me sitting there with the envelope in my lap, and he stopped. He said, "Are you all right, miss?" I said, "Tobias, sit down." He sat. He did not speak. I said, "Did your father ever talk about the men who worked in the administrative office of the Silver Creek line?" He said he did. I said, "Did he keep records?" He said, "Miss, my father kept records of everything. He wrote in a daybook every night of his life from the year before I was born until the week he died. I have them all, 26-day books, stacked in a crate under my bed." I looked at him. He said, "Do you want me to bring them?" I said, "Yes, please." He stood up. He did not ask why. He did not ask what I was looking for. He nodded to me once the way he nodded to iron when it had told him what it wanted, and he went back down the platform stairs, and I heard his boots on the gravel of the spur road as he walked back toward town at a pace that was not quite a run, but was not quite a walk either. He came back 3 hours later with a canvas sack over his shoulder. He laid it on the platform. He opened it. 26 black-bound daybooks, ordered by year. He said, "What year, miss?" I said, 1882, 1883. He took out 2 of the books. He handed them to me. I sat on the platform step and I opened the book for 1882. I began to read. The entries were the entries of a working blacksmith. Iron delivered, tools repaired, shoes set on such and such a horse. But every Saturday night at the end of each week there was a longer entry, a weekly summary, a record of who had come through the forge, who had ordered what, who had paid and who had not, who was hiring, who was firing, the small human commerce of a working town. In the weekly summary for the first Saturday in October of 1882, I found it. New office opened at the depot by the Silver Creek line. Staff as follows: Chief Clerk R. McAllister, Assistant Clerks H. Boggs, J. Peavy, and S. Holloway. Holloway is the one with responsibility for the maintenance file. He is said to be a careful young man. Philadelphia educated, come out for his health. He has taken rooms with the widow Farrow. I read the sentence twice. Holloway, the one with responsibility for the maintenance file. I looked up at Tobias. I looked past him at the locomotive on the rails at the cottonwood sapling, between the second and third car at the afternoon light coming down through the pines. Silas Holloway had been the man at the Silver Creek line office who received the maintenance reports. Silas Holloway had been the man who stamped them under review. Silas Holloway had been the man who put them in the drawer. Silas Holloway had been the man who did not repair the section of track above mile marker 47, the track that gave way on a rainy night in April of 1883. The track that sent my father's engine toward the edge of a canyon with a full train of passengers behind it. And 18 months later, Silas Holloway had shown up at my mother's door with a bouquet of paper flowers and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had not courted my mother because he loved her. He had courted my mother to make certain that no one in her household would ever ask the questions she might have started asking if left alone about the files he had buried. He had buried the files, and then, like a careful man covering his tracks in snow, he had come to the house of the widow, and he had buried us too. I stood up. I did not know I was standing. The daybook fell from my lap onto the platform boards. Tobias caught my arm. He said, "Miss, sit down. Please." I sat. I pressed both of my hands against my face. I didn't cry. I did not have tears. What I had was a feeling underneath the skin that was older than tears, a feeling like ice water moving through the capillaries. I said, "Tobias." He said, "Yes, miss." I said, "That man, Silas Holloway, he is my stepfather." Tobias did not answer for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I know who he is, miss. Everyone in town knows who he is." I said, "He killed my father." And Tobias, who was 22 years old, who had been at a forge since he was 12, who had the quiet of a man who listened to iron, put his hand over mine on the platform boards. He said, "Miss, we will make this right." The sun was going down behind the ridge. The locomotive stood on the rails in the amber light, enormous and patient, exactly as she had stood the first day I had seen her, exactly as she had stood on the day my father had last climbed into her cab. The cottonwood sapling between the second and third car trembled in the evening wind. Somewhere up the canyon, very faintly, the way I had thought I heard it on my first morning, I thought I heard the echo of a train whistle. I closed my eyes. I listened, and I understood that this was no longer a story about a girl who had bought a station for $100. This was a story about a daughter who had come to finish what her father had started. And the man who had put him in the ground was still alive, still in town, still sitting in a parlor 3 miles down the road with a fire in the grate and a stack of papers on the table beside his chair. He did not yet know that I knew, but he was going to. I did not go into town that night. I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. I wanted to walk the 3 miles down that spur road in the dark with the 23 maintenance reports pressed against my chest and the day books of a dead blacksmith in a canvas sack over my shoulder. And I wanted to stand on Silas Holloway's porch. And I wanted to knock on his door, and I wanted to watch his face when he understood that the daughter he had ignored for 11 years had come home carrying the thing he had spent 14 years burying. I did not go. Tobias Marsh stayed on the platform with me until the stars came out. He did not speak much. He built up the fire in the brazier. He put a pot of coffee on. He watched the road. I understood without him saying so that he was watching the road because he did not trust what might come up it and because he intended to be between me and whatever came up it if it came. Obadiah arrived a little after 9. He came up the road on foot with a lantern swinging in his hand. He had heard in town that something had happened. He did not know what, but he had felt it the way old men feel weather in their shoulders. The 3 of us sat on the platform steps for a long time. I told Obadiah what I had found. He listened without moving. His face did not change. But when I got to the page in the daybook, the page with the name, I saw his free hand close into a fist in his lap and stay there. When I was done, he did not speak for a long minute. Then he said, "Miss, I would like to go with you when you do what needs to be done. I would like to be on your right side when you walk into whatever room you're walking into. Will you let me?" I said I would like that very much. He said, "Good. Then we have some planning to do. Because if we walk in there wrong, he will have every one of those papers in the fire before morning, and the second time, there will not be a copy." We did not sleep that night. We sat on the platform and we drew up a plan. I was not going to Silas Holloway's parlor alone. I was not going to stand on his porch and give him the chance to shut the door in my face. I was not going to let him see the papers in a room where he controlled the fire. I was going to take this out of his house. I was going to take it to a place he could not control. The plan came together piece by piece in the firelight. Obadiah knew a man in Denver, a state rail inspector named Cadell, an old colleague from the line who had risen up through the Colorado Territorial Railway Commission in the years since the Silver Creek closing, and was now at 58 one of the 3 men in the state with the authority to reopen an old case of industrial negligence. Obadiah would write to him. He would write tonight. Tobias would ride into Canyon City in the morning and put the letter on the morning mail car bound for Denver. Mrs. Thornberry would be brought into it, carefully, in daylight, at the station, not at her home. Ephraim Pickering would keep working on the wall. He would keep working with his eyes on the spur road. He would keep a loaded rifle in the wheelbarrow beneath a tarpaulin. None of us would speak of the papers in town. None of us would speak of the papers anywhere that was not the platform of the station. The papers themselves, the 23 reports, would not stay in the basement any longer. They would stay on my person, in an oilcloth bundle beneath my coat day and night, until the inspector from Denver was standing in front of me. This was the plan. It held for 4 days. On the 5th morning, I came down from the office with my coat on and the oilcloth bundle against my ribs, and I walked out onto the platform to find Obadiah already there, white as chalk, sitting on the platform step with his hat in his hand. He said, "Ren." I said, "What?" He said, "They came in the night. The eastern wall is down." I walked around the side of the station. 40 feet of Ephraim Pickering stonework, 40 feet of a wall that a man of 63 had restored with his own hands over 3 months, stone by stone with mortar. He had mixed himself from lime and local sand. The wall lay in rubble at the base of the facade. The stones had not just fallen, they had been pried out. Someone had come with iron bars and had worked in the dark quietly enough that I had not heard from inside the building, patiently enough that they had brought 40 feet of my father's wall to the ground. Ephraim Pickering was sitting in the grass about 20 feet from the rubble. His left eye was swollen shut. There was blood on his collar. He had his hand pressed against his ribs. I ran to him. He waved me off before I could touch him. He said, "Miss, I'm all right. I'm breathing. I'm sitting up. That is more than some men manage." I said, "Who did that?" He said, 3 of them, in kerchiefs. I came up at first light to get a head start on the day. I heard the work on the stones. I went around to stop them. They were bigger than me. I said, "Did they take anything?" Ephraim looked at me. He said, "Miss, yes, they took something." He pointed. My eye went where his finger pointed, to the back of the building, to the door of the freight office. I was running before I had decided to run. The trap door was open. The lantern was gone. Someone had gone down into the basement in the dark while I was sleeping. I climbed down. The box was still there. The boxes on the shelves were still there. The papers in the chest with the broken hasp were still there. They had not come for the reports. They had not known about the reports. They had come for the blue notebook. The blue notebook was gone. Station project, 46 pages in my father's hand. The manifesto on the last 3 pages. The line that said, "Whoever finds this book, finish it for me." It was gone. I stood in the basement with the lantern in my hand, and I felt something in me go very still. I came back up to the platform. Obadiah had gotten Ephraim to his feet and was helping him toward a wheelbarrow to wheel him down the spur road to the doctor. I stopped them. I looked at Ephraim. I said, "Were they masked?" He said, "Yes, miss. Kerchiefs over the face the way men do when they do not wish to be known." I said, "Did one of them limp?" Ephraim looked at me. Slowly. He said, "Yes, the biggest one. Left leg. Dragged it some." I said, "Silas Holloway limps in his left leg. He has since the winter of '94 when he broke his ankle on a patch of ice." Obadiah said, "Miss." I said, "I know." I said, "Go. Take Ephraim to the doctor. Go." They went. I walked back around the station to the rubble of the eastern wall. I stood in front of it for a long time. I put my hand on the topmost stone that was still standing. I said to the wall, to the stone, to my father, I said, I am sorry. We will build it again. We will build it better. Then I went into the freight office, and I sat at the desk with the photograph of my father and Obadiah in front of me, and I wrote the letter to the inspector in Denver myself. I did not trust the mail any longer. Silas had people now. Silas had clearly been watching the station. Silas had clearly understood that the longer he waited, the worse his position got. Tobias rode for Denver himself the next morning. Not to Canyon City, not to the mail car, all the way to Denver, 160 miles on the back of his father's old gelding. He said he would be back in 7 days. I gave him a copy of one of the maintenance reports to carry as proof of what we had. I kept the original 22 on my person. He rode out at first light. That was the day the town sheriff came up the spur road. His name was Cletus Brody. He was a heavy-set man of 50 with a tin star on his vest and a mustache that had been dyed too dark for his own complexion. I had known him all my life. He had known Silas Holloway for almost as long. I'd been told as a child that Sheriff Brody was a friend of the family. I'd never liked the way he looked at my mother. He rode up on a gray horse. He did not dismount. He said, Miss Ashby. I said, Sheriff. He said, I understand there's been some trouble up here. I said, there's been considerable trouble. He said, Mr. Holloway has made a formal complaint in town. He has alleged that you have been taking property that does not belong to you out of the home you grew up in. He has further alleged that you've been making statements in town, slanderous statements about his personal character and his conduct during the period of his employment with the Silver Creek Line, which closed, as you know, 14 years ago. He has asked me to come up here and have a conversation with you about both matters. I looked at him. He looked at me from the saddle. I said, Sheriff, my eastern wall was destroyed in the night. My friend Ephraim Pickering, who is 63 years old, was beaten by 3 masked men. Certain property was stolen from this station. Are you going to ask me any questions about that? He said, I am aware of the incident. I am looking into it. I said, are you going to ask me who I believe did it? He said, Miss, I would caution you against making further accusations without evidence. He let the words hang. He let me understand them. I said, Sheriff, I understand you. I understand you very well. Good day. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned his horse. He rode down the spur road. I watched him go. I understood, watching the dust come up behind his horse, that the law of this town was not going to help me. The law of this town belonged in small but meaningful ways to Silas Holloway. I was going to have to bring the law from somewhere else. Tobias was riding for Denver. The inspector was a week away at best. Until then, Silas was going to keep coming. Mrs. Thornberry came up the road 3 hours later with the hat box under her arm and a second smaller box I had not seen before. She saw the rubble of the eastern wall as she came up the clearing. She did not stop. She did not exclaim. She walked past it to the platform, and she set the second box down on the boards, and she said, Miss Ashby, I have something to tell you. I said, Mrs. Thornberry, please sit. She sat. She kept her gloves on. She kept her back straight. She said, I heard about Mr. Pickering last night. I heard about the wall this morning. I've been making a decision for 15 years. I made it finally on the walk up here. She opened the second box. Inside the box were 24 sheets of paper, handwritten, in a woman's hand. The hand was not one I recognized. She said, these are copies. My mother made them. The night of April 17, 1883, the night your father died, the office at the Silver Creek Line held a meeting. My mother was the junior clerk on duty. She was told to remain late and take notes. Mr. Holloway was present. Mr. McAllister, the chief clerk, was present. A representative of the railway's owners was present. They discussed the accident. She paused. She pressed her gloved hands together. She said my mother heard Mr. Holloway say that he had received 6 written reports over the preceding 6 months recommending repair of the track above mile marker 47. She heard him say that he had stamped each of them under review and placed them in the back of the file. She heard him say that the repair would have cost the company $3,200 and that the board of directors had made their position on unnecessary expenditures quite clear. She heard him say, and these are her exact words as she recorded them that night, that he did not believe the condition of the track was as severe as Mr. Ashby had represented it to be, and that if it proved to be otherwise, well, these things were the nature of the work. I could not speak. She said my mother went home that night. She sat at her kitchen table until morning. She made copies of everything she had written in her notes. She made copies of the original reports which were in the file cabinet in the office. She hid those copies in a flour tin at the back of her pantry, and she kept them there for 40 years. She looked at me. She said my mother told me on her deathbed last winter that one day the daughter of Jonas Ashby would come to town, that I would know her when I saw her, that I was to bring these papers to her on the day that I understood she was ready. She pushed the box across the boards to me. She said I understood 2 days ago. I sat on the platform steps with the box of my dead friend's dead mother's notes from 40 years ago. And I understood that nothing about this story had ever been an accident. That there had been hands all along moving pieces across a board that had been laid out before I was born. That old men and old women had been carrying secrets for 14 and 40 years, waiting for a 19-year-old girl they had never met to walk up a telegraph pole with a paper in her coat pocket so that they could finally, at the end of their lives, put those secrets down. I kissed Mrs. Thornberry on the cheek. I had never kissed her before. I do not know that anyone had kissed her in a long time. She went back down the spur road with her gloves on. Tobias came back on the 7th day. He came in at sundown on a borrowed horse because his father's gelding had gone lame outside Colorado Springs on the return leg, and he had left the horse at a livery and paid the last of his money for a fresh one to finish the ride home. He was gray with dust. He could barely stand. He had not slept in 2 days. He climbed down off the horse and he handed me a folded piece of paper sealed with wax, and he said, "Miss, Inspector Cadell sends his greetings. He will be in Pikes Hollow next Tuesday on the afternoon train. He will be bringing 2 deputies from the Territorial Marshal's office. He said to tell you to hold and to keep the papers on your person and to trust no one, and he said specifically that if any sheriff in your town attempts to take the papers from you before his arrival, you are to refuse and to say the name Cadell, and any Colorado lawman worth his star will back off." I took the letter. I opened it. I read it. The inspector's writing was small and precise and unmistakably the writing of a man who had seen enough wrong done by railroads in his time to be long past patience with it. He wrote that he had reviewed the copy of the maintenance report Tobias had brought. He wrote that the stamp under review was a stamp that had been in use at 3 railway offices in Colorado in the early 1880s, and that one of those offices had been the Silver Creek office, and that the personnel rolls of that office for that period were still held at the Commission archive, and that he would bring certified copies. He wrote that if the original 23 reports existed, and if they bore the hand of Jonas Ashby and the stamp of Silas Holloway, then the Colorado Territorial Railway Commission would have grounds for criminal referral. He wrote at the bottom of the letter in a separate line, set off by itself, "Your father was remembered in Denver, Miss Ashby. There are men here who never stopped remembering him. Hold your ground." I read the letter 3 times. I held Tobias's arm. I helped him sit down on the platform step. I brought him water from the pump and a bowl of stew. He ate with the slow concentration of a man who had forgotten he was hungry. Obadiah arrived an hour later. I gave him the letter. He read it. He did not say anything. He took off his hat. He looked at the locomotive for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said, "Tuesday." I said, "Tuesday." He said, "We can hold until Tuesday." On the Saturday before Tuesday, Silas Holloway came one last time. He did not come with the lawyer. He did not come with his carriage. He came on foot. He came alone. He came up the spur road at noon in his dark traveling coat with his flat-crowned hat in his hand and his left leg dragging just barely the way a man who has been carrying a lie for a long time drags it without noticing. I saw him coming from the eastern wall where Ephraim and I and 2 other men from town who had heard about the attack had already started to set the first stones back in place. I put down my trowel. I walked out to meet him in the middle of the clearing. I didn't bring Obadiah. I didn't call for Tobias. I didn't want this conversation to be something somebody else had to carry. Silas stopped 10 paces from me. He looked at me. He looked at me for longer than he had looked at me in 14 years. He said, "Wren." I said, "Mr. Holloway." He said, "I have come to ask you a question." I said, "Ask it." He said, "What do you want?" I looked at him. I said, "I want you to understand something." I said, "I want you to understand that I am not my mother. I am not a widow with a child to feed who will take a bouquet of paper flowers at the door because she is lonely and afraid. I am not a young woman who needs a man to provide her with a roof. I am not a child in a storage room who can be ignored into nothing. I have a roof of my own. I have a wall of my own, even if part of it is presently on the ground, and I have people who have come to help me put it back up. I have my father's papers. I have every single one of them. I have the signed reports. I have the copies of the meeting notes from April of 1883. I have the day books of the blacksmith who recorded the personnel roll of your office. I have a letter in my coat pocket at this moment from Inspector Cadell of the Colorado Territorial Railway Commission, who will be arriving in this town on Tuesday afternoon with 2 territorial marshals at my request to review this material. He had gone very still. I said, "I want you to understand that I know what you did. I know that you had 6 months to repair that track and you put the reports in a drawer. I know that you sat in an office and decided that $3,200 was worth more than my father's life and the lives of the 91 passengers he pulled off the edge of that canyon by the skin of his hands. I know that you came to my mother's door 18 months later with paper flowers and a smile, not because you loved her, but because you wanted to make certain that no widow of Jonas Ashby would ever, in any quiet moment of her grief, start asking the questions that might have led her to you. I know that you built a silence around her and then around me for 14 years because silence was the instrument you needed. I know that you burned papers in your fireplace the night I left your house. I know the stamp you were burning. I know who you had come to see you in your parlor 2 weeks before I bought this station. I know what you told him. I paused. I held his eyes. I said, "I know everything." He did not move. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Wren, you are a young woman. You are 19 years old. You are capable of imagining a great many things. That does not make them true. You have found old papers in a ruined building. You have been listening to an old man who has resented me for a long time for reasons of his own. You have been consorting with a young blacksmith who has his own reasons to wish me ill. Your mother is not here. Your father is not here. You have no one to tell you which of these stories are history and which are the embroidery of people with their own purposes. Come home with me, Wren. Come home. Let us speak of this as a family. Let us not do this in a courtroom." I looked at him. I said, "Mr. Holloway, I do have someone to tell me which of these stories are history. I have 23 documents signed in my father's hand. I have 24 documents copied in the hand of a dead clerk. I have the daybooks of a dead blacksmith. I have the personnel rolls that Inspector Cadell is bringing from Denver. I have a man of 73 who sat beside my father in the cab of an engine for 12 years. I have the letters my father wrote in the basement of the station he intended to save. And I have the letter my father left in this station on a date I do not yet know, a letter I have not yet found, but which I believe exists because my father was the kind of man who knew how to leave things for the daughter he was not going to see grow up." I stopped. I said, "You are not my family, Mr. Holloway. You were never my family, and I am not coming home with you." Silas Holloway did not answer. He stood in the middle of that clearing in his dark coat with his hat in his hand, and whatever it was in his face that had once been a smile practiced in a mirror was no longer there. Something else was there. The face of a man who had spent 14 years believing he had buried a thing, and who had just understood at noon on a Saturday in April that the thing had never been buried at all, and that it had in fact been growing the whole time. Growing the way a cottonwood grows up through the coupling between two railway cars. Patient, unhurried, reaching for the sun. He turned. He walked down the spur road, his left leg dragged. Tuesday came. Inspector Cadell arrived on the 2:40 afternoon train. He was a tall man, narrow in the shoulders, gray at the temples, with the posture of a man who had spent his career walking along railroad ties with a notebook in his hand. 2 territorial marshals came with him. One was young and quiet, the other was older with a mustache so thick it looked like a second hat. They met me at the station. Not at the railway station, at the Pikes Hollow telegraph office, which Obadiah had determined was neutral ground. I was there at 2:30. I had the oilcloth bundle under my coat. I had Mrs. Thornberry's box of copies in a carpet bag at my feet. I had Tobias's daybooks in a second bag beside it. Obadiah stood on my right. Tobias stood on my left. Ephraim Pickering, with his eyes still swollen half shut, stood by the door. The inspector read the papers for 40 minutes without saying a word. When he was done, he folded his hands over them. He said, "Miss Ashby, I would like you to walk me over to Mr. Holloway's residence. I would like my marshals to walk beside us. I would like you to point out the house. After that, I would like you to go back to your station, and I would like you not to be present for what happens next, because what happens next is the business of the state of Colorado, and it is not a thing a daughter should have to watch." I said, "Inspector." He said, "Yes." I said, "I have waited 14 years. I am going to watch." He looked at me. The old marshal with the mustache made a small sound in his throat that might have been a laugh. The inspector said, "All right, Miss Ashby, you may watch, but you will stand where I tell you to stand." I did. I stood on the far side of the road in front of Silas Holloway's house, while the inspector and the 2 marshals walked up his front porch and knocked on his front door. Silas opened it. He looked at the inspector. He looked at the marshals. He looked at me across the road. He did not try to run. He did not try to speak. Perhaps he had known since Saturday that this moment was coming, and had decided in the intervening days that when it came he would meet it standing up. I do not know. I have never known what was in that man. The inspector read him the charge. He was arrested for criminal negligence in the death of Jonas Ashby and for the falsification of records in the conduct of a public carrier. They took him down off the porch with his hands behind him. They put him in a wagon. They drove him out of town on the road toward Canyon City. I watched the wagon go. I watched until it was over the ridge. I didn't cry. Not then. I cried later. Up at the station, on the platform step with Obadiah on one side of me and Tobias on the other, I cried for a long time, not out of joy, not out of grief, out of something older than both of those things, out of the feeling of a weight that had been on a family for 14 years, finally beginning to slide off. The trial was held that July in the district court at Canyon City. I will not describe it in detail. It lasted 6 days. My papers were entered. Mrs. Thornberry's mother's papers were entered. The day books of the blacksmith were entered. The personnel rolls from Denver were entered. Obadiah testified. Mrs. Thornberry testified. The old engineer who had been foreman of the Silver Creek line testified, brought in from his farm outside Pueblo where he'd been living quietly for 10 years. I testified. I sat in the witness chair. I answered the questions. I did not look at Silas Holloway while I spoke. I did not need to. The jury was out for 4 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on both counts. The judge sentenced Silas Holloway to 20 years at the territorial prison at Canyon City. He was 50 years old. He would be 70 when he came out, if he came out. I walked out of that courtroom into the afternoon sun. Obadiah was on my right. Tobias was on my left. Mrs. Thornberry was behind us in her white gloves. Ephraim Pickering was behind her. The Rocky Mountain News carried the story on the front page 4 days later. There was a photograph of the station. There was a photograph of my father taken in 1878, a photograph I had not seen before, borrowed from the Commission archive. There was a line beneath my father's photograph that read, "Jonas Ashby Engineer, Silver Creek Line. Remembered." I cut that line out of the paper. I folded it. I put it in the envelope with the photograph of Obie and Jonas from 1874. The envelope lives in the drawer of the oak desk in the basement now. That is where my father's things live. That is their home. The restoration took 18 months. The grant came from the Colorado Historical Society in late summer of 1897, shortly after the trial. It was a modest sum. It did not cover everything, but it covered enough to bring in a retired rail engineer named Ezra Blackwood from Denver, who spent a month at the station with 2 grown sons of the line's old maintenance chief working on the Duchess. They didn't make her run. That was beyond our means, but they stabilized her, they cleaned her, they treated the iron. When they were done, she stood on her rails with the dignity of an old general who had finally been brought his sword. Ephraim Pickering rebuilt the eastern wall, stone by stone again from the beginning. He did it without complaint. He said the second build was going to be better than the first because now he had seen where his first build had gone wrong. He was 64 years old by the time he finished. He stood back from the wall on the last day, and he looked at it for a long time, and he said to no one in particular, my daddy would have had a word to say about that. Tobias replaced every door hinge in the station. He built a new brass number for the clock face. The clock itself was rebuilt by a clockmaker from Leadville, whose grandfather had installed the original in 1857. The clock ran again. On the interior faces, it kept accurate time. On the exterior face, the one visible from the spur road, I asked the clockmaker to leave the hands at 22 minutes past 4. It was a choice some people did not understand, and I did not need everyone to understand it. The hour my father had died was not an hour I intended to let the town forget. Mrs. Thornberry helped me catalog the photographs, all 47 of them. They hang now in the main hall in glass frames above a long oak bench where visitors sit to read them. One afternoon in the 6th month of the restoration, when we were pulling up the rotten boards of the mezzanine floor, one of the volunteers called down that he had found something strange. We came up. Beneath the rotten pine, under a century of dust, there was a mosaic, Italian tile, blue and cream, a locomotive in motion across an open prairie with mountains in the far distance. It had been laid probably by one of the craftsmen of the original construction, And then it had been covered decades ago by a floor that must have been installed in haste, and nobody living in the town had any idea it was there. We restored the mezzanine around the mosaic. We left the tile exposed. Visitors climb the stairs now for no other reason than to look down at that floor. And they stand there in silence, and I have watched grown men with calloused hands take off their hats. On a Thursday in late spring, a woman I had never seen before came up the spur road on foot carrying a cloth bundle in her arms. She was perhaps 50 years old. She said her mother had worked at the station as a girl selling peaches on the platform in the summer months, and had taken certain things home when the line closed in 1883, believing that one day someone would come who would want them back. Her mother had died 3 years ago. The things had been in a trunk in her attic. She opened the bundle on the platform, a wall clock, the original wall clock from the waiting room, an iron stamp the size of a man's fist, with the words Silver Creek Line cut into the face. A single heavy iron key, the key to the front doors. She handed them to me. She said my mother told me I could go in peace once these were home. I thought she meant in peace when she passed. I understand now she meant in peace anywhere. I could not speak. I nodded. I took the bundle. She touched my face with her hand the way an aunt might, and she walked back down the road, and I didn't see her again, though I know her name now, and I know where she lives. And I wrote her a letter 2 months later to thank her, and she wrote back one careful page, and I have her letter in the desk. The opening was held on a Saturday in September of 1898. The light that morning was the gold of late summer, turning toward fall, that particular high mountain gold that a person does not see anywhere else. People came from Pikes Hollow. People came from Canyon City. People came from Denver. A reporter came from the Rocky Mountain News. 2 of the owners of the small local papers came. A photographer came with a large wooden camera on a tripod. Obadiah sat on the platform bench that Tobias had built to his exact measurements, with his straw hat in his lap and his hands folded over it. Old men from town came to sit with him one by one. Men he had worked with, men whose fathers he had worked with. They did not need to say much. They sat on the bench beside him, and they looked at the Duchess on the rails, and then they stood up, and another man took his place. I watched him all day from a distance. I watched his shoulders straighten, hour by hour, the way a young tree straightens in the sun after a snow has melted off it. In the late afternoon, an old man came up the spur road, leaning on a cane, holding the arm of his grandson. He was 92 years old. I did not know him. He said his name was Silas. I stood very still when he said it. He saw my face. He held up a hand. He said, "Miss, I know. I was born before the other one. He is no kin of mine." He walked to the edge of the platform. He looked at the Duchess for a long time. His grandson held his elbow. He said in a voice that shook, "I got on this train when I was 16 years old going up to work in the silver mines. I thought I was going to come back rich. I came back alive. That was enough. I was on this platform the night your daddy did not come home, miss. I was in the waiting room when the news came. I never thought I would stand here again." He turned to me. He said, "You did a good thing." Obadiah stood up from the bench. He walked to the old man. The 2 of them stood beside each other at the edge of the platform. Neither of them spoke. They looked at the Duchess together. I turned away. I did not want to be the one watching that. It was after the last visitor had gone, after the lanterns had been lit along the platform, after Obadiah had gone home, after Tobias had gone back to his forge, that I found the letter. I was walking through the main hall one last time before locking the front doors. I had the heavy iron key in my hand. I was checking the walls out of some old habit of care. And I saw at the base of the western wall a single stone that sat differently than the stones around it. The mortar around it was newer, not new from our restoration, new from before, from long before. I pried the stone loose. Behind the stone, set back in the thickness of the wall, was a metal box, a tin box sealed with waxed cloth. I took the box down to the platform. I sat on the bench where Obadiah had sat all day. I opened it. Inside was a single folded letter, my father's handwriting, the right-leaning script, a little rushed, written by a man who knew he might not come home. The envelope was addressed to my mother, and on the envelope a second line. And if for any reason she cannot receive this, let it be given to our daughter when she is old enough to understand. I read the letter. I will not set it all down here. Parts of it are mine. They live in the space between a father who can no longer speak and a daughter who learned too late and exactly on time how to hear him. But there is one part that I will tell. At the end of the letter, my father wrote that the greatest gift he could leave me was not money and not property, and not anything a person could hold in their hand. He wrote that the greatest gift was the knowledge that the world was full of abandoned places waiting for someone who would not turn their head away. That if I was truly his daughter, I would know how to recognize those places when I found them. I folded the letter. I put it back in the tin box. I put the tin box back in the wall behind the stone where he had left it for me. It lives there still. I'm 21 now. The Duchess Station receives in an average month a little over 2,000 visitors. We have a small museum of the Rocky Mountain Railroads and the men and women who built and ran them. We have a room dedicated to my father and to the 91 passengers he saved on the night the track gave way above mile marker 47. We have a cafe in what used to be the first-class waiting room with the arched windows framing the pines. We have a children's program that brings schools up from 3 counties. A federal engineer has written to me about a partnership that would, if the funding comes through, allow the Duchess to run again a short distance on special days. I do not know yet if it will happen. I think about it, though. I think about what it would be for her to whistle once more after 40-some years of silence. I think about what Obadiah would do, whether he would be quiet as is his way, or whether he would finally weep, which he did not do the night my father did not come home. Obadiah is 75. He works at the station every day. He is the most requested guide. Children crowd around him. He tells them how a steam boiler works. He tells them what it was to be an engineer on the Silver Creek line. He does not tell them about my father directly except when they ask. When they ask, he tells them. He tells them that there was once a young man with a tilted cap who touched the flank of his engine before every run because he believed that anything that carried people deserved to be treated with respect. Tobias still comes most evenings. He is 24 now. His shoulders are a little broader. He is teaching a boy of 15 how to work iron. I do not know yet what Tobias and I are to each other exactly. I know that he is good. I know that he does not take up more room than he is given. I know that when he shows up at the platform at sundown, something in me settles. That is enough for now. Everything in my life that has mattered has taken its own time to arrive. Sometimes at night, after the last visitor is gone and the station is dark, I sit on the platform bench in Obadiah's place. I look at the Duchess on the rails. The moss has been cleared. The iron has been treated. But the marks of time are still on her because those marks are part of what she is, and we did not try to pretend they were not there. The cottonwood is still growing up through the coupling between the second and third car. I will not cut it down. I have told the engineer from Denver more than once that if we bring the Duchess back into service, it will have to be on some other track because the tree stays. The creek still runs behind the platform. It catches the moonlight between the spruces, and sometimes when the wind is right and the night is quiet, I think I hear the whistle of a train very far away, somewhere up the canyon where no train has run for 15 years, and I close my eyes the way my father used to. It is not grief, it is recognition.